Hi, my name is Anna Gzmabusa. I'm the director of the Europe Center, and together with Catherine Stoner, the director of the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, we are co-sponsoring the Rethinking European Development and Security speaker series. And it is my great pleasure to introduce the inaugural one for the winter quarter, Pauline Jones, who is professor of political science and the E.D. Goldberg director of the Michigan and Washington program at the University of Michigan. And Catherine, Pauline and I go back, way back. We're all in grad school together. And I just remember Pauline as being the single most intrepid and intimidating comparativist of her cohort, who would basically... You said that to me. No, I never thought you were intrepid or intimidating, but you're scary. That's different. Just scary and intellectually terrifying. At any rate, Pauline is a very highly regarded expert on Central Asia and the post-Soviet space. She's focused her research on political identity and religion, institutions, state formation, and the resource curse. And most recently, the role of trust and other factors in the adoption of COVID mitigation policies. She's the author of Institutional Change and Political Continuity in Post-Soviet Central Asia, and Oil is Not a Curse, Ownership Structure and Institutions in Petroleum-Rich Soviet Successor States. Most recently, she's co-edited the Oxford Handbook on Politics in Muslim Societies. And today, she'll speak on the future of the CSTO, Russia's war against Ukraine, domestic policy opinion, and alliance stability. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Pauline.
Well, thank you everyone for being here today. This is really exciting. This is new research. It's collaborative research. It's going to be really hard for me to stay behind the podium. But I'll try because I think it's better. I won't be blocking the screen if I do. It's collaborative research with my colleague, Regina Smith, who's at Indiana University. Many of you may know of her work on Russia and protest. She's one of the leading experts on these topics. And shortly after the mass protests in Kazakhstan in January of 2022, which were an historic event, she and I decided to apply for an NSF Rapid to do some field research, surveys, which included embedded experiments, and some media analysis. And so this, what I'm going to present today is a very small part of that larger project. We did get the NSF Rapid, and we're applying for a full NSF to explore further. Focus today, is the mic okay?
Yeah, I accidentally muted you. That was my fault.
My kids would love that ability. So I'm just going to start, I'm going to focus on the part of the piece of the CSTO, which again is a small part of this larger project, but I'm really excited about it. And just a brief roadmap so you know when it's okay to leave, I guess, or you can leave if you want to. First is to talk about the motivation. The motivation is both substantive and theoretical. There are two big questions driving this research. And then the empirical focus, I want to say a little bit about why the CSTO. The CSTO is the Collective Security Treaty Organization. I'm going to refer to it as CSTO henceforth. So just so everyone knows. Why the CSTO, what it is, why it matters, and then why Kazakhstan in the context of the CSTO. It's not the only member, there are other members, so why Kazakhstan? Then I'm going to just briefly go through the theory about the relationship between public opinion and foreign policy. There are a lot of skeptics that say public opinion doesn't matter, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and why we think it might matter in this case. And specifically, I'm going to talk about this key mechanism that's been identified in really recent research, both that looks at democracies and autocracies on audience costs. And I'll define that for you when I get to the theory section. Then I'm going to go through our data, talk a little bit about the survey. I'm happy to answer clarifying questions about it during the talk or after, of course, after the talk is over, to talk about how we set up this. We got to ask a direct question and have an embedded list experiment. I mean, that is the gold standard. Very exciting. Sometimes in love and research, you get lucky. We got lucky. And then I'm going to talk about some of the preliminary findings. I haven't done any I've done some multivariate regression analysis. It's not ready to present. So I'm going to do some bivariates. I'm going to show you the comparison between the list and the direct. And the punchline is that support for the CSTO among the Kazakhstani public is very low. It's relatively low to what we would expect, okay, based on the list experiment and the direct question and the comparison. And it's divided. And it's divided in a really interesting way, which is that it's divided across ethnic groups, Kazakhs and Russians, and within the Kazakh ethnic group. And we have evidence to support that. So I'm not just saying it, I actually have evidence to support it, which is really important in this context. The implications, I think, are, so what does this mean? What does this kind of audience cost, these ethnically based, really, audience costs mean for Tokayev? What does it mean for his decision-making, both, he became, he's now at the head of the CSTO. It was his turn, so he took over the chairmanship, right? what does it mean for his decisions about both the future of the CSTO, his role in it, and relations between Kazakhstan and Russia, because of course we're using the CSTO as a proxy for this broader question of Kazakhstani relations with Russia, right? You know, what does it mean for the future ethnic stability within Kazakhstan? So, okay, what are the motivations? So like I said, two questions, two big questions, one more substantive, one more theoretical. The substantive question is, what are the longer term implications of Russia's renewed aggression in Ukraine in February 2022 for relations with what Putin has called the near abroad? Those are his words, not mine. It's very important. Of course, it's not the first time that Russia has threatened the sovereignty of its neighbors. We know this, right? From the Saturday Night Live, we know this. Georgia is a case in point. But I think it is the first time, and a lot of this is based on some of the excellent work that Catherine's done. This is the first time that Russia is projecting weakness, both militarily and economically. So it almost presents an opportunity, right, to challenge not just Russian aggression, but a Russian dominance in the region. And Russia has always presumed its dominance in Central Asia. The Central Asian leaders are questioning that dominance, and the time seized right. The question is, will it be challenged? And so that leads to the theoretical question, right? And you could look at this from many different angles. We just decided we were really interested in the domestic public opinion angle, right? So under what conditions will domestic public opinion, or can domestic public opinion influence a change in foreign policy? And particularly, when can it disrupt alliance stability? This is a pretty, more or less, a pretty stable alliance. We can talk about that. And so what I like about this project, what I'm excited about, is first, again, it's engaging with this growing literature that says, you know, contra the consensus, the omnipotent consensus, right? There is a relationship between public opinion and foreign policy. It does matter. And it doesn't just matter in democracies in the US. This literature has gone beyond that to other non-US democracies as well as autocracies, including China. This key mechanisms I identified, I'm going to talk about later, is these audience costs. But we don't know a lot about how we measure these. How do we measure audience costs, especially in authoritarian regimes, right? What's the best way to get at them? And how they operate in this context. I have a multi-ethnic state, right, Kazakhstan, in which the dominant minority, it was a multi-ethnic and post-colonial state, excuse me, in which the dominant ethnic minority has very strong ties to the metropole. Okay, so it's a really interesting and specific, but also I think generalizable case. We also don't know a lot about the specific case of alliance durability. How does public opinion, or to what extent does public opinion influence alliance durability? So not just foreign policy in general, but the specific case of alliance durability. So I think for empirical and theoretical reasons, or substantive and theoretical reasons, it's a really interesting kind of side project. Okay, why the CSTO? What is this? The CSTO is a Russian-led and Russian-organized collective security organization. It was established in 2002. Its predecessor was the Collective Security Treaty. Its current members are Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia. Previous iterations of this included Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. They all left for good reason, as you can imagine. The primary purpose initially was collective defense. All right, if anybody was attacked, so it's a sort of a NATO kind of style. NATO Article 5 is CSTO Article 4. Some call it Eurasia's NATO, but this is the idea of the collective security to combat threats against armed attack, or collective defense against armed attack. It has evolved since then, or devolved, depending on your perspective, to include internal stability and any kind of threats to incumbent leaders, namely from quote unquote terrorism, right? That's often thrown around and not necessarily a real threat, but something that can provoke an intervention. And that happened for the first time in January 2022, right? So when Tokayev, the president of Kazakhstan, the current president of Kazakhstan, invited the CSTO, which is again dominated by Russia, into Kazakhstan in January 2022 to quell these mass uprisings, which were initially sparked by, no pun intended, fuel prices. This was a major turning point for the CSTO because it was the first time it had intervened on the grounds of national stability, right, and anti-terrorism. And prior to this, it had been completely ineffective and almost, completely inactive and ineffective. It hadn't intervened in other conflicts it might have or should have intervened in, whether it was Azerbaijan and Armenia or border disputes between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. So this was a big turning point. It also occurred just prior to Russia's renewed aggression in Ukraine in February of 2022. Okay, so and this, of course, Kazakhstan used similar narratives about Russia needing to come to the rescue of Kazakhstan that Russia used in needing to come to the rescue of Russians in Ukraine. So it sets things up very nicely, if you will. Finally, the CSTO is emblematic of what many have called Kazakhstan's multi-vector foreign policy, where Kazakhstan has tried to balance Russia against other interests, primarily China and the West, but it's still been dominated by Russia. Okay. And it's something where the CSTO for Kazakhstan is much less about direct benefits that it receives than this tool for maintaining its foreign policy flexibility. So that's kind of the context of the CSTO and why it's important, not just generally, but in Kazakhstan. So why Kazakhstan? Of course, there are other members, so why do we focus so much on Kazakhstan? So Kazakhstan, I think, is pivotal, just given its size and its importance, not just in its role of its economy. If Kazakhstan leaves the CSTO, that's a major blow, right? It's unlikely the CSTO will survive a departure from Kazakhstan. So it's significant. Kazakhstan's foreign policy stance for the CSTO is significant, not just because it's the largest and most important of all of the CSTO members, the non-Russian CSTO members, but also because Kazakhstan is considered to be the regional hegemon in Central Asia economically, not militarily, but that's about to change. So at the same time, the other thing I think is interesting about focusing on Kazakhstan, or it's important to focus on Kazakhstan is really facing these countervailing pressures, right? To stay or to go. You know, it's like the Clash. Some of you are probably too young to remember that song, but should I stay or should I go? It's definitely facing those countervailing pressures. On the one hand, these recent events that I just mentioned are putting pressure on Kazakhstan to leave. CSTO intervention in the January 2022 events was very unpopular in Kazakhstan. We know this anecdotally, we know this through survey research, very unpopular. It helped fuel some of the protests. Some of the protests that were then put down violently by the Kazakhstani government were about CSTO troops in Almaty and in Western Kazakhstan. Okay. The escalation of the war against Ukraine, very unpopular, right? According to some polls, 20% of Kazakhstanis, I have this, of Kazakhstanis were in favor of or supported Russian aggression in Ukraine in 2022. I like to show this just because I think it's really telling of what these protests against the Ukraine war were like. And this is the largest protest to date in a former Soviet country against the Ukraine war. It was in Almaty in March of 2022. And not only is she holding a banner that says, yesterday Georgia, today Ukraine, tomorrow Kazakhstan, where Kazakhstan's in red, right? So they get what's going on, that's sort of the importance of this historical moment. But the protesters are also holding signs that I don't have pictures of, demanding that Kazakhstan leave the CSTO. So these things are connected for people on the ground. Okay. Back to why Kazakhstan and sort of the increased pressure to leave. So you've got the CSTO intervention, the escalation of the war against Ukraine, both pressuring Kazakhstan to make a decision about pulling back from Russia. At the same time, you've got this mass influx in September, October of 2022 of Russians who are fleeing conscription, right? Putin announces mass conscription in September of 2022. Russians flee into mostly northern Kazakhstan, but also Astana and Almaty to some extent. And there's this huge sense that this might cause some multi-ethnic tensions. And in order to alleviate these multi-ethnic tensions, Kazakhstan needs to, Kazakhstan needs to remove itself from, or to not give these Russians, let's say, power over Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan needs to kind of back away from Russia. Okay, so I said countervailing because then on the other hand, the ethnic composition, which of course is a constant, is not changing, but is shifting a bit because of these migrants, these relocanti who are coming in from Russia after the mass conscription. There are pressures to remain. Kazakhstan's ethnic composition is about 70% Kazakh. It's about 25% Russian. Most of the Russians live along the border with Russia in the northern regions. They're heavily concentrated. Like I said, largest minority. This in the past. The fact that ethnic Russians are concentrated along the border with Kazakhstan has been a source of stability, multi-ethnic stability, good trade relations, something that has been celebrated by both countries. But it becomes very complicated by the fact that there are these Russian migrants flowing in, and it's really not clear. Again, countervailing: are these relocanti going to put pressure on Kazakhstan to stay, or actually be disruptive enough that they'll put pressure on the Kazakhstani government to want to leave and Kazakhstani citizens to want to leave? We have some data on how people actually feel about these Russians. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but yes, there are two big waves. This is the second wave of the Russian migrants from Russia. Okay, so that's why CSTO, why Kazakhstan. What about the theory? Why should we expect public opinion to have any influence at all on foreign policy? Of course, there's this long-held skepticism, this long-held consensus that, in fact, public opinion doesn't matter at all. Why doesn't public opinion matter? Well, because people are uninterested in foreign policy and they're ill-informed, right? So their preferences are unstable. We don't have to think about them, we don't have to worry about them, and certainly foreign policy leaders don't think about them. And this is supported by theories of alliance stability, especially by realism, that says, look, it's all about external factors. It's all about the international, context. It's all about the balance of power and the balance of threat. And so we don't have to worry about these domestic factors, okay, outside of maybe role theory and some liberals. Okay. Recent research is much more optimistic, if you want to call it that public opinion does matter. Why? First, public opinion has been shown to actually be fairly stable and structured. Still uninformed, but stable and structured, right? People are adamant about what they don't know. And the research has been expanded beyond democracies and beyond the US, as I mentioned earlier, to autocracies, particularly China, but other autocracies. Some really interesting work on this. And what's interesting about the work both on democracies and autocracies is they both talk about something called audience effects. They both focus on something called audience effects as the key mechanism whereby public opinion affects foreign policy. Audience effects are defined here as the negative societal reaction to foreign policy decisions that undermine popular support for the ruler, the regime, the party, the incumbent, whatever you want to put in. What's key about audience costs and what's not expressed enough in this literature, particular literature on autocracies, is that they function very differently. They have to, right? In democracies, it's probably pretty obvious. They function through elections, electoral mechanisms, right? But in autocracies, we think they function more through opinion expression. And this seems a little bit wanky, because it's like, oh, just express an opinion. Why does authoritarian regime really care if their population express opinion? Yes, and it cares how they express it. So you can think about a continuum of, they can express it by engaging in chat on social media, right? Or they can do it by answering some survey questions, whether it's the government's or ours. I can pretty much guarantee you the government has a copy of our survey. And they can mobilize in the streets, protest, right? And protest is a real threat for authoritarian regimes, right? For many reasons. So that's kind of what we're still developing this, but this is kind of what we're thinking, is that's the trigger, that's the mechanism whereby public opinion affects foreign policy in autocracies. And again, some of the work on China supports this. Okay, so rubber meeting the road, how do we connect the theory to the empirics? Like I said, we got really lucky in that we got this NSF rapid in April of 2022. I'm so grateful for it. And we were able to do a pilot and then a full survey, nationally representative sample, all 17 urban centers. And we chose urban centers for a reason. I'm happy to talk about that later. As well as 17 urban centers, right, of all the 14 regions, plus Asanamati and Shymkent, which are the regions of special cities of special significance, excuse me. It took over 3 months, right? And it was post-mass survey. So the pilot was conducted prior to the mass conscription. The nationally, again, we got lucky. We didn't know Putin was going to do that. The mass, although I'm not going to talk about the pilot versus the full sample today. I can in the Q&A, but it's not on the slides. And so that followed the mass conscriptions. It took about 3 months. We recruited, it was a recruitment sample through random phone numbers, right? And then people were given an online link to go to a survey. So over 3 months, following these key events, total sample 3,300, 2,400 plus oversample in 3 key. Again, I can talk about why we picked these 3 in 300 each. Okay. So again, got lucky, got to ask this direct question. We were surprised because we thought this is politically sensitive. And in the pilot, they wouldn't let us ask directly. So we did not think we were going to get this opportunity. We got this opportunity. We took it. And then we also got to, and so the direct question is very, I'm sorry, that's actually incorrect. Do you approve of Kazakhstan's participation in the security, in the Collective Security Treaty Organization? And then it said, who the participants are, so that everybody knew. Yeah. List experiment, for those of you who are not familiar with the list experiment, it's a deceptively simple way of asking people questions or at least getting people's responses indirectly when you think those responses are likely to be misrepresented because of sensitivity, political sensitivity, right? So it's used a lot for race. I see Hakeem, nodding his head. Yeah, it's used a lot for, you're not going to ask someone straight up, are you a racist, right? So you want to kind of put in a list of a racist policy or a racist preference that then might expose you being a racist without forcing you to say that you are. So the importance about a list experiment is that it's a random assignment to the control of the treatment, right? The control has 3 or 4 items. The treatment then has 4 or 5. The politically sensitive policy or statement, right, is in the treatment and not in the control. Okay, so that's what you're treated to. You're treated to. It sounds funny. In our list experiment, the treatment, right, the politically sensitive question is about the CSTO, whether you support the CSTO. So we're asking the direct question, and the key is, I almost mentioned this, you do not ask them which ones, so they don't have to reveal their true preferences, or which ones, but just how many. How many of these policies do you support? Not which ones, okay? So that's the idea behind it. Okay, and then, well, I say deceptively simple because the analysis is so simple. And then you just compare the means, right? You just subtract the mean of the control from the mean of the treatment, and you've got your percentage of, right? Okay, everybody gets it. That's lovely. Yeah, okay, great. See, lots of nodding, lots of smiling. Maybe it's just because you like your lunch. I don't know. All right, so I'm going to summarize the 3 main findings before I show you the data, just so you know where I'm going. I'm going to take a little drink. Big finding is that popular, as I already summarized at the beginning, popular support is pretty weak, it's low, and it's divided. When I say weak, it's below 50%. I think that's weak. And it's divided particularly along left ethnic lines. Our list experiment results reveal this, and the bivariate analysis when we look at our demographic variable. We measure, yes, Marianne.
Can I ask a point of information?
You can.
When you did the survey, did you screen for whether people knew what CSTO was? And how many people knew?
We don't screen for what they knew it was. We only say who the members are.
So
we're pretty convinced that, or pretty confident that in these urban centers, people know what the CSTO is. It's just been invited into their country to put down protests, mass protests. Yeah, yeah, but it's a great question. And I see why you'd be concerned with that. So thank you for raising that. Okay, so yeah, please. Yeah, of course.
What's the refusal rate?
That's a great question. It's about 30%. Yep, great question. Yeah, no, and we check for all the sampling errors and all of that. So yeah, so I'm very confident in this data. These data, excuse me. Oh my gosh, my Michigan just left me. So popular support for CSTO weak and divided along ethnic lines. Again, we know this for, oh, I know where I was, bivariate analysis. So we're looking here, we measure ethnicity in 2 different ways. And I'd like to do a 3rd way, but I just didn't have time. The first is self-identification. All right, what's your ethnicity? And the second is self-identification plus what is the language you speak, you primarily speak at home and with your friends. Okay, and so we have both Kazakhs and Russians, right? Just self-identification, and then we have Kazakh mixed and Russians. Russians only speak Russian or primarily speak Russian. Kazakhs only primarily speak Kazakh, and then the mixed is it's all Kazakhs who speak both equally, they say. Okay, so those are that kind of becomes a. When I show you the results, you'll know what I'm talking about. So not only is popular support, that's the second finding, divided across ethnic groups, it's divided within ethnic groups within the Kazakh majority. And we know this by comparing responses between the list experiment and the direct question. I'm going to talk a little bit about, we have a theory, a mini theory of sources of bias and how they might be working here. And the punchline is that social desirability bias seems to be exerting a much stronger effect than fear bias. But in authoritarian regimes, we tend to think that fear bias matters more. So I'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, the last finding I want to talk about is, other than demographic variables, so the demographic variables are strong, the attitudinal variables, which most of the foreign policy literature emphasizes, seem to be reinforcing, I guess, this divide between the Kazakhs and the Russians and within the Kazakhs. And so I'm going to show you some attitudinal variable data. And it's about beliefs in Russia. That's a shorthand term, but that's what it appears to be. All right. Okay. Individual beliefs about Russia. All right. So support for the CSTO, entire sample about 47%. This is, I said I wasn't going to do it, but I'm going to do it. The pilot, we got 55%. So there does seem to be a shift, although again, I don't want to claim too much about that because there's so much variance between the pilot and the full sample. Ethnicity measured as self-identified. Again, being Kazakh, just self-identified lowers your support. It's associated with lower support, right? When you have all three groups that I talked about, both being Kazakh and mixed lowers your support, although it lowers your support, and these are all significantly different, right? There's significant differences. It lowers your support more if you're Kazakh, speaks primarily Kazakh, than mixed, right? And then Russians overall have a stronger support. They're much higher than average in terms of the support. Yes, sir.
Again, a point of clarification. The survey is collected in Russian with Russian telephone respondents and Kazakh.
They have the option of Kazakh or Russian. That's a third way I want to measure ethnicity, actually, is what language did you actually take the survey in? You say you picked Kazakh, but did you actually take the survey in Kazakh? Yeah. So yes, they had the option. Anything else? Okay. So again, comparing the direct and the list experiment, I want to first just back away from the data and talk a little bit about this, if you'll indulge me here. I think that most studies of authoritarian states think about the desirability bias, right? The political sensitivity as stemming from fear that you give a response that's different from what the leadership wants you, what the party, what the authoritarian, the autocrat, what wants. But there's this other social desirability, right? That's more about preferences that are similar to, right? The fear of expressing preferences that are contrary to your social group, right? And if you think about how these might work together, right? If you're a regime supporter, so fear, operates differently if you're a regime supporter or a regime opponent, right? And same with social desirability, whether you're in the Russian community or the Kazakh community, you're going to infer, and we're making an assumption here, that if you're Russian, you're going to think most people support the CSTO, right? And if you're Kazakh, you think most people don't support the CSTO, right? So you have the sort of working together, this fear bias on the one hand and this community preference bias, maybe we'll call it, on the other hand. So we predict that Russians are going to be more likely, if they're regime supporters, they're not going to feel fear or social desirability. So the responses in the list experiment are going to be very similar to the responses in the direct. They don't have any reason to falsify their preferences, right? If they're a regime opponent, though, they're not so much worried about social desirability, but they're worried about both the social desirability and fear. So they should be more likely to falsify their preferences, right? If they're regime opponents, because they're anti-CSTO, right? And they don't want to say that because they think all Russians are saying that. They also don't want to say that because they think the regime is pro-CSTO. Okay. For Kazakhs, it's a little more complicated. If they're regime supporters, they're going to face the social desirability bias, but not the fear, right? And if they're regime opponents, they won't face the social desirability bias, right? Because they're on the right side of things in terms of their community, but they are going to face fear. So we think Kazakhs are going to misrepresent to a much greater extent than the Russians are, but the Russians will still have an incentive if they're regime opponents. Okay, here's what we find. Both sources of bias clearly exist, but what seems to be stronger is the social desirability bias, the community preference bias, I think I want to call it now. And it's strongest for the Kazakhs. You can see that and again, I'm only defining identity or measuring identity, ethnicity as self-identity right now. I'm going to do it for mixed later, and you'll see that becomes even more interesting. So yeah, there's a significant difference between what Kazakhs are saying on a list experiment and the direct experiment. And it's in the opposite direction of what you might expect, right? Kazakhs who are more likely to, who support the CSTO are more likely to say they don't support it, right? So Kazakhs want to say they don't support it because they're assuming that other Kazakhs do support it. And so even though they don't, right, they're claiming that they do on the direct question. Okay, that's what we get from comparing the direct and the list. For Russians, it's weaker, and it only comes out really as statistically significant when you measure ethnicity this way for Russians. So again, the social desirability bias affects Russians as well, but not as strongly, not as, I don't know, what do you want to say? It's not as substantively impactful as it is for Kazakhs and for this mixed category, which I think is really interesting. I think we need to do more analysis there. Yes.
Do you mind going back to the
I don't.
previous slide and just saying what you said again so that I can check it?
that about Kazakhs, that Kazakhs are more likely to say that they support the CSTO when they don't. So their preference falsification is we don't support when they actually do, right? And I think a lot of that's being picked up by this mixed category. I think that mixed category are people that actually are, I'm gonna call them, and I know this is not politically correct or maybe sound insensitive, but I'm gonna call them Russified Kazakhs, right? Kazakhs who are, and it's important. So they're more likely to speak both Kazakh and Russian equally, right? Whereas, and this is important because Kazakh nationalism is becoming a very strong force in Kazakhstan. And as the country gets, as the country gets younger, right? You got, 50% of the population is under 40, right? This is a strong force. And these are Kazakhs who are supporting these new language law initiatives, which are going to Latinize the alphabet. That was announced in 2023. This is not a coincidence. I know you weren't asking this, but supporting the closure of Russian schools, Russian language schools. They really want Tokayev to double down on Kazakhization. And it's, yeah.
Let me ask a completely naive question. You're assuming that these groups, that their opinions are related to their ethnicity.
I'm not assuming, the data is telling me that. We have not.
But social desirability bias, though,
yes.
You're measuring
Yes,
it with reference to their ethnic group.
Yes, I'm theorizing that based on the ethnic group, that's what the social desirability bias is going to look like, and then I think my evidence supports that. Of course, this is just the comparison between the direct and the list. We haven't done the multivariate. I will tell you that the initial multivariate analysis that we have done, and it gets kind of really complicated, and we haven't done all the robustness checks, show that ethnicity seems to, I don't want to say steal, siphon off all the significance. Ethnicity is driving this. So it's not an assumption. It is an assumption in theory, but the data, I think, back it up. So there's some empirics that go beyond making an assumption where I think I can demonstrate, not beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's not causal identification, but
you're assuming only two of the major ethnicities.
I'm assuming two major ethnicities, Russian and Kazakh, but also this mixed category, which are Kazakhs that are Russified.
But no Uzbeks, no Tajiks.
I do not. They're in the sample, but remember they're about 10%. They're like less than 10% of the population. Our sample, it's nationally representative, so we've got the percentages match up with the national percentages, but they're such a small number we can't make big inferences, right? But you're right, we should look at them. You're absolutely right. That's a good point. Kazakhs are 70%. Russians are 20 to 25%, depending upon whose data you look at, and then the rest are Uzbeks, Ukrainians, Uyghurs, Germans. Who am I missing? Missing anybody? Maybe. Yes, sir. I can't hear you. Mixed marriage. I don't have data on mixed marriage. Yeah, no, I don't have data mixed marriage, but I would presume both the mixed and the Russians are. That's what's happening. That the proxy of what is your primary language that you communicate with, your friends and at home and your family and friends. That's a really good proxy for that. So I think we have that covered, but thank you for raising that. Yeah, these are great questions and great. Yeah, okay, so where was I? Oh, all right. So this is just to show. So not just is the second primary finding, which is or preliminary finding, which is we have divisions both across and within ethnic groups, right? And then I think the attitudinal variables, which again is something that's really emphasized in this literature on foreign policy, public opinion and foreign policy. The attitudinal variables should matter more than the demographic variables. We're actually finding the demographic variables really matter, but so too do the attitudinal variables, right? So here, there are a lot more of these. These are the ones I kind of summarized. Again, I said something about beliefs in Russia, beliefs about Russia, I think is the way I summarized it. You'll see that those who have strong support and trust in Putin associated with higher degrees of support for CSTO. This is also highly correlated with ethnicity. The Russians really trust Putin. The Kazakhs who speak only Kazakh do not. They also don't really trust Tokayev, but that's another story. If you believe the trust data, some people don't. and for good reason. Attitudes toward Russia, this is about economic relations. Should we maintain an economic relationship with Russia? What are the costs and benefits? And a series of questions. If you have a positive attitude toward economic relations with Russia, again, your higher level of support for the CSTO. I can say more about that if people are interested in the relationship between the economic relations and security relations. I think it's interesting. And then what is the most important problem facing Kazakhstan? Right, so here you have things like, I'm going to forget some of the options, but the economy, so economic, the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, security threat, ethnic conflict. So those who said ethnic conflict was the most important problem facing Kazakhstan were more likely to also support the CSTO. And then, so those are the ones that the attitudes I think that are for more support, right, are fueling, I don't know if that's the right word, are associated with, I'll say that. More support for stronger support for the CSTO. These are the attitudes that are associated with weaker support or lower support for the CSTO. And you'll see there's quite a difference, right? So if you think the impact of the migrants overall is really bad for Kazakhstan, it's causing lots of problems, okay, then you're less likely to support the CSTO, right? You see the migrants as a threat, as a proxy threat from Russia. I think that's how I would interpret it. And then we asked some specific questions about the migrants. What are the most important, the biggest problems that migrants are causing? And if you think, economic problems are the biggest problems, the migrants that came, for those of you not familiar with this, that came in two waves. There's first in sort of February, March 2022, through the summer, and then again after the mass conscription, were two very different ways. But one of the common threats that they posed was a threat to prices and availability for real estate, for housing, and food prices and shortages and things like this. So there is an economic impact that a lot of people in these regions feel where the migrants came, the relocanti came. If you think the problem with Russian migrants is it could increase Russia's influence, and here's a direct measure, right, of my interpretation of the first one, then your support for CSTO is lowered. You're going to see Russia as more of a threat. These migrants are giving Russia an excuse, like in Ukraine, to come into Kazakhstan. And then again, what's the most important problem facing Kazakhstan? The Ukraine war. War in Ukraine, you're much less likely to, your support for CSTO is lower support for CSTO. So those are the attitude variables. Okay, implications, so what? Why does this matter? I think that what we're seeing, and again, we need to do more data analysis. What we're seeing so far is that public opinion does seem to be polarized across ethnic groups, within ethnic groups. This is dangerous for Kazakhstan because it really could upset a very delicate social peace, a very delicate balance between ethnic Russians and Kazakhs. That previously has been sort of a pillar of the regime's policy. Under Nazarbayev, the predecessor to Tokayev, he was very careful. He would talk the good talk, about Kazakhization and the importance of the Kazakh language and culture, but he didn't really enforce any of the policies, including some of the language policies, and so much Kazakh had to be on the airways versus Russian. And he did a lot of posturing, but he didn't do a lot of enforcement. Tokayev actually has been more than pandering to the ethnic Kazakhs, the Kazakh nationalists, who, as I said, are growing in numbers, not just among the population, but in the government. And he's more willing, the current president is much more willing to enforce language policies like proficiency tests and close Russian schools. And like I said, they're considering a new language law. They've already instituted the Latinization, right? So not going to use Cyrillic anymore. Uzbekistan did that in 1993. So Kazakhstan's like one of the last ones to do it. Turkmenistan closed its Russian schools in 1995. So Kazakhstan's a little slow on this, and a lot of that has to do with this large Russian minority along the border for sure. But those days I think are in the past. I can give more examples of this, but Tokayev's moving forward on Kazakhization, and it's very popular among the Kazakhs, of course. Those who do support the CSTO are reluctant to say they do among the Kazakhs. And I think that's important because on the one hand, I mean, the government can't take public expression as a true indicator of what people actually think. So these audience costs are actually kind of false in some sense, right? They're false preference articulation. But because of the social pressure from those Kazakhs who actually are saying they don't support the CSTO and they don't, the pressure the social pressure on those who do support to say that they don't, and then to actually start to believe that, I think, to conform to that position, I think is very likely to lead to some kind of defection cascade. I was thinking about this just yesterday. I was talking to Margaret Levy about this, and this whole notion of David Layton's tipping point. Well, I'm at Stanford, so yes, think of David Layton and the tipping point, and sort of thinking about it in reverse. So he talks about it in the context of Estonia, and how Russians assimilated once they saw a critical mass, I'll just say that, of other Russians assimilating, right? This could happen in reverse, where ethnic Kazakhs see the writing on the wall, right? They see there is a tipping point, and so they're reverse assimilating, right? The ones that I said are Russified Kazakhs are saying, oh no, we have to get on the bandwagon of Kazakhization. And then finally, I think that this tells us something about why Tokayev is behaving the way he is toward the CSTO, right? He's really kind of hedging his bets. He's trying to, they just took, it was Kazakhstan turn, so they just took over the chairmanship. Tokayev took over the chairmanship of CSTO. And he's really trying not to make any decisive moves and talking a lot about reform from within of the CSTO. So nothing decisive in the short term, but I think in the long term, for all the reasons I stated, he could be forced to choose sides. And I don't know what the longer term is. I don't know the longer term is 2 years. I will say that, I said one way of thinking about audience costs, the materialization of audience costs, the triggering of audience costs, is protest. And I've seen recent polls, I didn't do them myself, there's as a team at Nazarbayev University has done it, shows that 30% of the population thinks that renewed protests are very likely in Kazakhstan. That's high. Yeah. So I think if that happens, right, that if there aren't decisive changes made vis-a-vis the CSTO, and there's enough of the population that supports decisive change, there could be protest mobilization, and that could trigger more decisive action on the part of Tokayev. So that's what I'll say. I'll end there, and thank you very much. Did I do that right, Amy?
Yeah.
Yeah. And sorry, I forgot to say thank you. I meant to say thank you at the beginning of my talk to Catherine and to, no, I did, but I got too excited. I get excited. I meant to say thank you to Catherine and Anna for inviting me. It was really great. And to the Freeman Spegler Institute for having me here. It's really great. And also to Amy for your impeccable organization. So thank you. Okay.
We all thank Amy, and we thank our lucky stars for Amy every day. That's CDDRL.
In the middle, if you can just click it so it's green, the Zoom audience will then be able to hear questions.
So when you're ready to take, when I'm ready to take questions, and I am not yet, then you just we make sure that's on, showing green is what she's saying. Well, Larry's really looking at me seriously. Okay. All right. So our division of responsibility is when we have a red seminar, we let Hashem off the hook from hosting the CDDRL seminar. So there he is, resting comfortably in the back, enjoying life. And Anna introduces, or I do this time, you do, and the other fields questions. So guess what I'm doing? That's right, fielding questions. So since I have the microphone, and I love that, I thought I would ask the first, Pauline. And Pauline and I were virtual roommates, so I'll just tell you that before it was cool. That is, we tag teamed on an apartment when we were graduate students.
Huh?
Never saw you, but anyway, it's the world's smallest apartment. I don't know. Anyway, we can barely get anything in there. Okay, so the CSTO, okay, very interesting. Good for you guys. Maybe a problem for Kazakhstan. I'm not sure it's a problem for Russia. And you started out with that, right? When Russia is appearing weak. So let me challenge that.
Okay.
I agree, has not comported itself well on the battlefield, to say the least. But the economy is actually surprisingly resilient, disturbingly so. I was just on a call this morning with a group that we have together here that Michael has put together, McFall, on sanctions and how to tighten them up with the Canadian government, actually. And because they're thought leaders, if you didn't know that, and extremely important in the world.
Well, they're Canadian, so of course.
Right.
Yeah.
So first, I'm not sure about Russia being weak and whether you should frame it that way as a question. Unpopular, fine. Something to worry about, and clearly they're worried about Russia coming in, right? So CSTO is one mechanism that Russia reaches into Kazakhstan, but there are myriad others, of course. And one notable one is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, right? So how is this sort of different? I mean, Kazakhstan's in some ways not dependent on Russia, but in other ways extremely dependent and heavily influenced, no matter what, by what happens in Russia, as dare I say, Canada is by the United States, and vice versa, people. Yeah. So is CSTO really, or just looking at that, the best way to sort of answer the questions you set out for yourself, and the suggestion that perhaps Russia is weak, setting it up that way? Power, as I've said, is of course relative, and relative to Kazakhstan, it is not weak. And clearly, there's fear of Russia, which is generating some of the results you're getting, as well as fear of its old regime. Okay, now I'll start a list, and I have to type your name, so I'll hold it the best I can. Okay.
Do I answer this question?
You go
Yes,
ahead and
okay.
answer that, and I'll start as I see people.
So, yeah, I think that when I didn't say Russia is weak, I said it's projecting an image of being weak militarily and economically. And in Kazakhstan domestically, people do perceive Russia as weak. They see Russian migrants flooding in. They see that there are new Russian businesses, investment in their country. They see a shift. They perceive.
The sign
sorry.
she held up indicated she's fearful that first there was Georgia, second.
Yeah, that Russia will come
Ukraine,
in.
and now Kazakhstan.
Yeah, that's March 2022, right? When there are these protests against the Ukrainian war. A lot's happened since then, right? So I do, and that's prior to the influx of the 200,000 Russian migrants who were telling people in Kazakhstan that Russia's weak. So I mean, I think there is a perception. I mean, maybe it isn't the best framing. Is CSTO a problem for Russia? Does Russia need the CSTO as much as the other members? No, but Kazakhstan, again, the Central Asian states as a whole, but Kazakhstan in particular, are responding to this by trying to shore up their independence and decrease Russian influence. So it may not be an immediate shift, but I think it's a gradual one that can at some point cascade. So what is Kazakhstan doing to bolster its military capacity so it's less dependent on Russia? I mean, economically, it's been doing this for a while, but militarily, it's all new since 2022. It has formed an alliance with Uzbekistan. They've had a rapprochement, which is a really big deal in the region. And Uzbekistan is the biggest military in the region. Uzbekistan, is not a member of the CSTO. It doesn't need to be a member of the CSTO. It's got its own military. It believes anyway that it's capable. I can't answer that. I'm not a military analyst, but it believes that it's capable of protecting its own borders. And it has now agreed to invest in and collaborate with Kazakhstan on building up its own military. Kazakhstan's increased its military spending, its budget. Kazakhstan has signed agreements with Turkey to build drones. I mean, so it's really responding in a way we haven't seen before. Is it going to be a decisive shift? No, but I think what I imagine Takayev's trying to do in the context of the CSTO is that he's trying to shift the balance of power so that it is more equal. That's the way he'd like it to be. And this goes back to role theory and the liberals, right, in foreign policy. It's shifting it into what he sees as Kazakhstan's role in the world, right? And CSTO in that image. And in that case, the CSTO could become a problem for Russia because it won't be a tool for blatant Russian influence and power. It'll become truly a collaborative institution in which Russia's got to sometimes take direction from Kazakhstan or other countries. And that's not what Russia set out to do when it founded the CSTO. Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I mean, this is like a classic balance of China versus Russia. I just wrote a piece that was published in the Columbia Journal of International Affairs on sort of how is this likely to affect China's interest in the regions. And one of the things I say in that piece is that the more Russia punts economically, or the more it looks like Russia is weakened economically and militarily, right? Because the longer the war goes on, the more entangled Russia gets. It doesn't matter whether it's militarily strong or not. It's shifting resources, and it has been shifting resources away from Central Asia, right? It's taken troops out of Tajikistan to send it to Ukraine, right? This is one big example of that. As a result, China, that's always dependent upon Russia for the security. China doesn't want to be in this business of providing security to Central Asia, right? It wants to be in the business of building its economic powerhouse in Central Asia, right? That's what it wants to do. But as Russia becomes either less willing or less capable of providing that security, that China might be forced to step in and step up, right? So that balance could be disrupted in the CSTO. The SCO could become more important. Now, as unpopular as Russia is with the ethnic Kazakhs, Turkey is even more unpopular. So there's that. I mean, sorry, China is even more unpopular. That's what I meant to say. China is even more unpopular. Turkey is also unpopular. I didn't want to give you that bad news, Sarah, but I have to. Yeah.
Okay, great. So next on the list is Eric Jensen. Why don't we introduce ourselves?
That would be great.
If you don't know.
Eric Jensen, I'm at the law school and CBDRL. Thank you for this presentation. Going at 78 RPMs a minute was fantastic. It was a real fire hose. But
Only Anna can talk faster.
I had two questions.
Competitive.
Two questions on the survey and then asking you to speculate. If you ask, just following on Catherine's question about Shanghai cooperation, if you had a poll about Shanghai cooperation as you did about the CSTO, how would you expect the results to change?
That's a great question.
And secondly, does your Russia sample include? I can't remember the dates you did the survey. Does it include new Russian migrants to Kazakhstan? And if so, what are the results of that? One can predict what that might be. But and then third, I'm delighted that you're doing this research because Central Asia has just been a backwater of research academically in too many respects. I was in Kazakhstan last August, and I was struck by this boisterism that you talk about among younger Kazakhs, and that seems to me will only grow. And yet Kazakhstan very much feels like it's next in line to be on the chopping block with Russia. And I'd like you to expand a little bit on that.
Yeah. I mean, I'll start there because I do think that there still is a perceived threat, and you're right, it goes back to Catherine's question as well, that Russia, that we don't want to antagonize Russia because we could be next, but we also want to reduce our dependence, both military and economically, on Russia, so we're not next. And so if we are, we can defend ourselves. You know, we want the EU, we want the West, the EU and the US to be, you know, more involved and engaged. We want Turkey to be more involved and engaged. China, people are still really wary about. They really, this has been, I haven't seen a change in this data since the end of the Soviet Union, that they're really wary of China. And I think it's mostly a numbers game. It's also what's happened in Xinjiang. There are a lot of ethnic Kazakhs now migrating, quote unquote, back to Kazakhstan from Xinjiang to avoid persecution. And they're being incentivized. I was going to say forcibly settled, but I'll say incentivized to settle in the northern regions that are dominated by Russians. So that's again part of Tokaya's policy of, you know, how can we kind of, so they're actively trying to counter this. I think they're realistic in that they don't want to directly antagonize Russia, because Russia still is a bigger military power. But would Russia, again, it depends on what happens in Ukraine. Right, as the longer that lasts, in some ways, the better it is for Central Asia. Economically, Central Asia is doing fine, partly because they're helping Russia evade sanctions. We know this, right? Another Saturday Night Live skit. We know this. So they're doing okay. But let me get back to the SCO, because the SCO, because I think that's a great question. You know, whenever, I don't know about any of you, but whenever you do a survey, you always regret that. Why didn't I ask them? Why didn't I ask them? But you also can't ask everything. So we didn't ask about the SCO, though I would anticipate, because of the negative attitudes toward China on any survey you look at, whether it's ours or it's the Central Asia Barometer, you'll see that, you know, attitudes toward Russia might be bad and in decline, but China is much worse. So I would suspect, most people don't know about the SCO the way they do the CSTO. Okay, so that's one. But B, if you tell them China's involved, it's like, no, thank you. So I think it wouldn't change. Yeah.
Okay, Sierra. Yeah, as long as it's on, you don't actually need it. It'll pick you up. It
Okay.
has to be on. Yeah.
Cool.
My name's Sierra Noda. I'm a PhD candidate in Russian and East European history and a CDDRL pre-doc. Two small questions. One is, if you could elaborate a little bit more on this idea that demographics is more important is fascinating. If you could elaborate a little bit more on how age figures into this, because I'm surprised that is not the primary differentiator here, that ethnicity is actually much more important if we look at it on Russia. On similar questions, for example, I would think age would be much more important. And then if you could talk a little bit about the media landscape in Kazakhstan surrounding this question. Particularly, you say, this is something that you don't even have to explain what this is to people in Kazakhstan, the CSTO. Since January 2022, we're almost 2 years out. Is this something that's still being covered regularly, and with what sort of angle?
I thought you were going to ask a different, these are great questions. I think you're going to ask a different question about the media, which was about whether or not what sources of the media people relied on was driving these responses. I was going to say, it's really interesting that the more, it doesn't matter. I know you're asking this, but I'm going to answer it anyway, because I like this question. The more you rely on state media isn't that significant in terms of whether you like or don't like the CSTO, whether you approve or disapprove the CSTO, but whether or not you rely on Russian language versus Kazakh language does. If you do Kazakh language only, you don't like the CSTO. If you do Russian language only, you do. And of course, that's not surprising. But again, sometimes when we collect empirical data, it's just to support what we already know, but to actually have evidence as opposed to just talk. Yeah. Okay, back to your questions. So age does matter. I mean, here's the problem is we haven't done the multivariate analysis, or we haven't done it to our satisfaction. So I can't tell you which, well, I can say that ethnicity seems to trump everything. So age matters, but ethnicity matters more. In terms of if I had put up more demographics, I would have showed you what we did is we divided the sample between those who had a Soviet experience and those didn't, not straight age, but like, are you 51 or older versus, right? And if you had the Soviet experience, you're above the mean, you're 55%, in terms of support for CSTO. So it does matter. It's also highly correlated with ethnicity, though, right? So older, yeah. And which language you speak, right? So there are more older people in that mixed category than there are in the Kazakh only category, which makes sense. Yeah, and that's part of what's, I think, exacerbating these interethnic tensions. The media landscape, another great question. Luckily, again, in research and love, sometimes you get lucky. Luckily, part of this research project, actually the biggest part of this research project is really about protest legacies. What are the legacies of these protests? Like the protests did not topple the regime, but how is the regime responding, and how are people's attitudes towards the regime changing based on how they anticipate and evaluate the government's response? Who do they blame for the violence, right? And so we're following both media analysis and the narratives in the media and how those change in both the Russian press, the Kazakh press, the independent press, the state press. We're following all of that, and then want to continue to answer, to rather ask a series of questions. In this survey, we do have vignettes about different narratives that are real narratives that are in different parts of the press, and so I can say something about that. We don't have narratives about the CSTO, but we are following media analysis of the CSTO, and what we're seeing is that it's very much, I should have said this in the answer in response to your question, it's very much in the news. There's debate, at least for the first few months after the January events, and either you call, if you're in the government, you call what happened in January, the mass protests, the January events. If you're ethnic Kazakh, or if you're in the Kazakh press, you call them Bloody January. So there's a real difference, and it comes out in the media analysis of how people are interpreting and evaluating and remembering these events. But the CSTO features prominently in the media, and a debate about whether or not Tokayev was right to bring the CSTO in. Again, for the first 3 to 6 months. But we do the survey in month 9, so yeah, I'm pretty confident that, yeah. But positive, as you would imagine, right? When you talk about the media landscape, positive in the Russian language and state media, negative in the Kazakh media, very negative.
All right, so
You sold us out. Yeah, people
Senator's next.
not happy. Good to see you, Mike. Thanks for coming.
Once the green light's on, you don't even have to hold it to your face. You can put it on the paper. Perfect.
Thank you. I'm Şener Aktif, Professor of International Relations at Koç University and a visiting affiliate of CDDRL.
And
very-
welcome.
Nice to meet you.
This is their first seminar.
Very significant. I mean, extremely significant because if Kazakhstan defects, actually there is no CSTO or
Thank you.
Eurasian Economic Union. Right? I mean, some would say with Ukraine this is already done,
Yeah.
but Kazakhstan is huge, 2.5 million kilometers, etc. So this will end Russia's supranationalism, its international project, all of it, right? I mean, this is extremely significant.
Thank you,
My
Shmir.
but my-
Just stop right there.
But later, overdue.
No, no,
We're dinner. Okay.
My
fantastic.
question is directly related to this because I saw it in your questions and it's very much parallel to the Ukrainian situation. What about Eurasian Economic Union? Right? And it was in your question because the Maidan protests in 2013-14 didn't start over NATO accession. They started over European Union accession agreement, which was, customs union and beyond. And people usually tend to, because economic union is less securitized, people might be more courageous or willing to protest economic ties with Russia and try to withdraw from. And if you withdraw from Eurasian Economic Union, again, it's dead because it's just Russia, Belarus, Armenia. They don't, I mean, they are insignificant. They don't matter. I mean, so it's going to be over. So this could be the trigger. So what I'm wondering is to what extent they correlate the CSTO attitudes with Eurasian Economic Union and to what extent they are willing to. And slightly relatedly, though not exactly, this is more kind of qualitative on Kazakh nationalism, because you said, and I agree, Russia might not care as much, though, for Eurasian Economic Union. But if Kazakh nationalism is expansionist and revisionist, right? I mean, the historic fear has always been some kind of pan-Turkism, right? If they somehow, and some of the Russians tell me that there is this irrational kind of fear about the Orenburg corridor, right? That small strip of land between Kazakhstan and Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, that the Turkic peoples will unite and Russia will split up if Kazakhstan truly becomes independent and link up with the Turks of Volga, Ural, Tatar, and Bashkortostan is just having protests right now. I mean, on a different issue, but still. So is there this kind of revisionism, expansionism in the mainstream ethnic Kazakh nationalism that you mentioned is on the rise? Because if it is, that's going to trigger Russia as well. So the first question may be more directly related. Second one is a bit of a stretch, but thank you, Colin, for this one.
Thank you so much. Yeah, these are great questions. So happily, we do have data on the Economic Union. We haven't analyzed it yet. No, I'm so happy about it because it's exactly right. So what previous research suggests is that generally speaking, Kazakhstanis are much more favorable about economic ties with Russia than they are about security ties. They're much more comfortable, right, with economic than security. So we would expect that they're going to be more favorable toward the EU than they are toward the CSTO. But more interesting is what are the demographic and attitudinal variables that are influencing whether people are more favorable to one than the other. And what is the role of these relocanti, right? These economic migrants that are coming in. Some are economic, some are political for sure. So that we need to explore that. We haven't done that yet, and I'm sorry for that because I would love to be able. I will be able to answer your question in a few weeks. How's that? Okay, so we'll be in touch. In terms of the nationalists, the growing nationalism in Kazakhstan and linking to expansionism, I am not aware of any sinister connection. I haven't seen anything either in writing or, but I haven't been following as closely as maybe some other people. So it's something that I certainly will look into. But this is, for now, it's mostly inward focused. Like, how can we, what's the right word? Not preserve Kazakhstan for Kazakhs, but
Make Kazakhstan great again.
How can we privilege Kazakh identity, culture, language in Kazakhstan, and how can we decolonize? Thank you. It's totally in the, thank you. It is completely in that, no, they use this language. It's not just coming from the West. They use language of decolonization and de-Russification as the means to decolonization. So it's very inward focused right now. I don't see what you're talking about with expansionism, but I mean, I'll look for it. I'll ask people. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. So.
All right, I think we have time for at least one more question, and one in the back there too. Gentleman in the middle of the table, and I apologize, I don't know your name. Yep, you're not. Yep. Nope. In the middle of the table, you're not looking at me. Yep, sure. Just as long as that is on green light, you can even leave it in the middle and
Conducted polling of a touchy issue. Can you tell us what the attitude of the Kazakh authorities were towards
Yeah, this is a great question. There's a part of me that wants to do this, long term wants to do this big project on why do some authoritarian countries or governments want to know what their citizens think and why do others not? Like what explains that? Because I think it's really interesting. I've never had a problem doing surveys in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, they don't want me anywhere near them. But Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan are fine with. My work is mostly about religion and religious identity. Okay, it's not about foreign policy and public opinion. And I've done surveys on religion and religious identity in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan that you can see is very politically sensitive. No problem. I'm sure they know about the survey because our survey firm was very careful, very cautious. And like I said, when we did the pilot in, did we do the pilot? Was it August? It was a few months before the full sample. Or was it July? I can't remember. They told us we could not ask these questions directly. We already kind of, we kind of already knew that. We knew it would be politically sensitive to ask about the CSTO, not the EAU. That's not sensitive, but the CSTO we knew was sensitive. So they told us we couldn't ask it directly, and we were fine with that. But then that changed in November, and we were told we could ask it directly. They didn't see any reason why we couldn't. And I interpreted that as them getting some kind of signal from the government. And either they inferred that from the newspaper coverage, right? And the fact that the government is allowing these differences of opinions about the CSTO and the intervention to air in the media, right? So maybe they inferred it from that, or they got some directive. I don't want to be conspiratorial about it. I will say that after the results came out and we started to analyze them, and of course, we're sharing the data because we want to work with scholars in Kazakhstan and particularly at Nazarbayev University, but also in this firm. They said, could you not publish anything until you let us know? Because the results they're scary. This is scary to the regime. Yeah. And we said, yeah, sure. I told them about this talk. I'm not saying which firm it is because I don't want to get them into any trouble. But yeah, so there's some hesitancy about the results, not the question itself, so to speak, but the results.
Interesting. All right, and I know we have a.
Yes, hi, I'm Grant. I'm actually part of the master's cohort of the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies Center. So it's funny, I actually had a very similar question about the Eurasian Economic Union. I'm glad to hear that you collected that data. This might perhaps be premature as a result as a question, but I was curious if you see any implications for sanctions cooperations with the West on dual-use imports into Russia from Kazakhstan. Obviously, it's one of the bigger trading partners. And I guess, especially in terms of your response regarding these contradictory motives with the EAU, there being an economic incentive versus a less favorable military cooperation angle, do you see audience costs factoring into that if this is even a matter being debated in public right now?
Yeah, great. I mean, I think for the EAU, I think the audience cost would be in the opposite direction, right? So I think more people want to remain part of the EAU and see it as benefiting Kazakhstan economically, and not as a threat, right? I mean, that's the thing with the CSTO is it's on balance. You see it as a protecting or threatening, right? Is it, yeah, and that's clearly there are differences of opinion about that. Whereas I think for the EAU, there's still, and again, I haven't looked at the data. I think there's still, I anticipate there's still going to be strong support, and it's not going to be controversial. One of the things that Nazarbayev, I do this all the time, darn it. It's hard. Thank you. Thank you. People are so kind. One of the things that Tokayev is doing and pushing back against Lukashenko and Belarus, for example, who's just, he's just a loose cannon. At the latest CSTO summit, Lukashenko, who was handing the reins over to Kazakhstan. So it's a rotating chairmanship. It's a year and it's just alphabetical order. So Belarus had it last, now it's Kazakhstan. There's nothing tricky about it. And he's handing over the reins to Nazarbayev and he goes, look, the biggest threat the CSTO faces is from the West. We have to, and Nazarbayev just doubled down. He said, no, it isn't. Stop that. And he wants to build relations between the CSTO and the UN. And he wants to make the CSTO kind of this international organization that kindler, gentler. It's fascinating to me. So he is not anti-West. He wants strong relations with the EU. He wants strong relations with the US. And he wants a CSTO to be kind of a normal, if I can say, international organization,
Keep China the heck out.
but keep China the heck out.
Okay, we're going to second rounders. Miriam, you never asked.
Well,
Question.
I have a question
period,
now.
So go ahead.
So-
Yes.
You started the talk by saying that you wanted to know how to measure and interpret audience costs in an authoritarian regime. And so I get you're in the middle of the analysis. I'm loving it. But tell me, when you finish the analysis, what are you going to say about how we measure and interpret audience costs in this case?
So I think that the way, I mean, I'm seeing that a little bit more straightforward, and maybe I shouldn't, maybe I should think that as a little more complicated, right? The way we're measuring it in this study is the comparison between the list experiment and the direct question, right? So which audiences are lying and why? What's the direction of deception and among whom, right? So, and how might that impact those that are falsifying their preference? So it's almost like, I feel like I'm trying, this is way, I mean, this is way overboard, but like Timur Kuran, like, okay, how do we know preference falsification, and what might be the cascade that
But here's
the
what
trigger
I
that-
don't understand. If people are falsifying their preferences, then what kind of, how does the regime interpret that? Do they know about it? And how does it affect them? Don't they just go, well, lucky people are too, pressured or scared to tell the truth, and so we're good. Like, does preference falsification play the same role on a regime as open expressions of dissent?
So the issue is, these are great questions. So the issue is that if the preference falsification is actually, I mean, it's part of the audience cost because it's public, right? So the expression, the survey is not public, although it will become public, right? Well, it is now, I guess. But I guess what I'm envisioning when I think about, okay, the audience cost can range from, again, so, social media, right? And chat and social media, which of course the government tracks, to actual protest mobilization. And if the protest mobilization comes from those who are, they're expressing their real preference, which is their anti-CSTO, and then you get those who are falsifying their preference, but are joining those protests because they feel forced, right, pressured through social desirability bias to express those preferences and join their fellow Kazakhs. That's when you're going to have a huge audience cost. The regime is going to face huge audience costs to maintain its current relationship to the CSTO in Russia. But it's if. This is speculative, right? I don't have a, yeah.
Okay. All right, last one, Alberto, you take us home.
More like a follow-up on this. I wanted to ask a question. One of the things that is very interesting about the way you set up this experiment is that you really have the social desirability bias crossing in the two ethnicities. So usually most experiments that use this method, you just know people are not going to reveal they smoke pot, or that they, whatever is the socially undesirable thing will be underestimated. But here you have underestimation and overestimation happening kind of across the two ethnic groups. So one thing I was really wondering is whether, can you tell us something, for example, about the, probably, I don't know anything about Kazakhstan, but are there a minority of Kazakhs who live in the 8 sample points that are in the border with Russia, in such a way that they would have a social desirability bias to conform with the Russian majority where they live. So something about kind of minority within the survey cities. I don't know if I'm making sense.
You are making sense. Yes. I mean, I think that's where some of the mixed category comes in. Yeah. I mean, I'd have to look at the regional level data, and I have looked at the regional level data. It's just that the numbers start to get really small. So I don't like to make big inferences of small numbers. But I will say that one of the things we're seeing is that if you just look at the regions, and I know you weren't asking this, but again, I'm going to answer a question I want to ask. The eastern regions are way above the mean in terms of their support for the CSTO. And I think that's all China. It's all about China. It's like we much prefer for Russia, right, to China, or right on the border. In the northern regions, support is very low. And also in Astana, which is the capital city. So the regional variables are telling us something, but again, the numbers are small. I could though look at the northern regions and kind of parse out those who are identifying as Kazakh speaking Kazakhs versus mixed speaking Kazakhs. And yeah, that's a great idea. Mhm.
Interesting. All right, well, we go to 1:15 and bam, 1:15, 1:14 and a half. Thank you very much, everybody, for your excellent questions. And thank you, Anna, as always, for doing this with me and us and CDRL.